Hello, we're back, and in this video lecture, we're going to talk about percentages, fractions, and ratios. Again, what is a percentage? Basically, a percentage is a fraction that's being converted to hundredths. So 34%, which is slightly more than a third, means 34 100ths. 34 is numerator, and the denominator is a hundredths. When we talk about percentages, we're always talking about converting a fraction into 100ths. Many times, percentages are not converted to whole numbers. So, for example, 1/8, if you're to divide 8 by 1, you wind up with 0.125 or 12.5%. Note with this, these are basically the same, right? So we have two decimal places, which you saw in the last video lecture. That is 100ths. This is 1,000ths. Hundredths is going to be 12.5. So 12.5% is basically the same as 0.125. So how do we change a fraction to a percentage? As we talked about earlier, we divide the numerator by the denominator and multiply it by 100. So in a very simplistic example, we have 1 divided by 2, which is 0.5. Then if we multiply 0.5 times 100, we have 50%, as it says in the last set of bullet points here. So again, more of the same. Multiply the decimal pot times 100, puts it in percent. 0.929 times 100, 29%. Very straightforward. Now, how do we go the other way? In other words, how do we change a percent into a fraction? Well, basically, we get rid of the percent sign and multiply it times 100, 1/100th. So in other words, 5% is basically 5 is the numerator into 100ths. And again, just as your math teacher a long time ago said, I'm sure at some point, fractions are always converted to their simplest form. So in the example of 5%, both 5 and 100 can be divided by 5, which leaves us with 1 out of every 20, or 1 divide 20. Still comes out to 5%. And again, changing a percentage to a decimal, get rid of the percent time, place the decimal point 2 places to the left. So basically that's what we're talking about in this example, 76%, 0.76. Note, as I think we touched on, 2 decimal places, 76, 76%, 0.76. Another thing we hear in healthcare a lot is a ratio. What exactly is a ratio? Basically, a ratio is talking about a numerical relationship between one number to another. And we calculate it by dividing the one number by the other. The number can be greater than 1 or less than 1. And the fourth bullet point kind of spells it out. If we have 7 men and 5 women in a group, the ratio is 7 to 5. Sometimes you see it 7/5, 7:5, or people saying it as 7 to 5. Basically the same. And just like fractions, we want ratios in their simplest form. So instead of saying there's 6 men to every 10 women, we would say 3 to 5, right? Because 6 and 10 have 2 as common denominator. We reduce it to its simplest form. And a proportion, in some ways, it's similar. It's a ratio, but we're saying it's a specific ratio where X is a portion of the whole, and the whole being X plus Y. So in a proportion, the numerator is always included in the denominator, and that's the big difference. Again, just to say that in emphasis, the numerator is always included in the denominator. And the second set of bullet points explains why. If we have 2 women out of a group of 10 over 50 who have had cancer, and X is 2, in other words, the women who have cancer, and Y is 8, women who do not have cancer, the proportion is 2, in other words, the numerator being 2, the 2 women who have cancer, divided by the number of women who don't have cancer, which is 8, plus the women who do. So 2 divide 2 by 8 is 0.2. So the proportion of women that have cancer is 0.2. Anytime we see the word rate, we're talking about a relationship between a numerator and a denominator. So a rate of miles per hour is how many miles somebody is driving in the denominator of an hour, right? So anytime you see rate, we're talking about a relationship between a numerator and a denominator. Sometimes we'll hear the term rate applied loosely to a proportion or a percentage, but basically we're looking for some relationship between a numerator and a denominator. The denominator, of course, is going to be the bottom number, which is often a large base set of observations, or as it says here, the large base population. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Again, most of this stuff is very straightforward. Let's take a look now on how we can do a lot of this in Excel. Okay, we're not going to do everything in Excel, just a quick review. Again, your formula toolbar to initiate anything, it's the equal sign. We can also use the functions that display here, sum, average, if, count, all these things. But if you're rusty on your Excel, I would suggest using the equals, and then you can either type the numerical value, or if they're already laid out in Excel, you can just go directly there. So right, so if I wanted to do a percentage equals, I'm going to type 50, and I can, instead of just typing number 50, I can just use the relative cell values, click on A2, divide. Note how the formula displays on the formula bar, 100. So that's 0.5. If I want to change this into percent, I can click on the whole cell, right mouse click, format the cells, right? I can have 2 decimal places. I can have percents. whatever I want, and it should stay. So you can see here, 50 divide 100 is there. Note here, you can see the formula, right? So when you turn in your homework, I should see formulas. Last year, we had some students who would just do these things on an adding machine and use Excel here to make it all nice in columns and rows. That's not going to work. In healthcare, we all use spreadsheets and we use Excel, and we need to see the formulas. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Please contact me if you have any questions. Bye now.